Welcome to today's special briefing, which is inspired by the Smithsonian Institution's new national initiative on race, entitled Our Shared Future, Reckoning with Our Racial Past. We are excited to introduce leaders of the Smithsonian and three major cultural institutions in Los Angeles, the first city where the Smithsonian is launching the Race Initiative. For EMS, this is a welcome complement to our work for the Stop the Hate Initiative funded by the California State Library. How can we reckon with a racial past if we don't know it? Asked the director of the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles. The museum is working with La Plaza de Cultura y Artes and the Japanese Museum of the Japanese Museum, which is part of the Center for the Preservation of Democracy. Actually, it's the Japanese American National Museum and its Center for the Preservation of Democracy, to present a series of public programs between December 1st and December 18th that will explore how race has transformed each of our lives and how racist events and policies of the past connect to deep structural inequities in our society today. Our speakers include Deborah L. Mack, PhD, Smithsonian Director of the Initiative and Associate Director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Leticia Buckley, CEO of LA Plaza de Cultura y Artes. Michael Trong, Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum, and James Herr, Director of the National Center for the Preservation of Democracy of the Japanese American National Museum. We ask speakers to speak slowly, as I'm doing, for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. And we ask reporters to enter questions in the chat. Our speakers are encouraged to answer questions in the chat throughout the conference. We will send a video of today's briefing with expanded bios and contact information for each speaker to all participants later today. And now I'm honored to present our first speaker, Dr. Deborah L. Mack. Dr. Mack, please tell us about the Smithsonian's initiative, what inspired it, and why you chose Los Angeles as the first city for its launch.
Thank you so much for this invitation and for this opportunity. This initiative began in 2020 and funded by a very generous gift by our founding sponsor, Bank of America. The gift was given in response to the murder of George Floyd. And because of Smithsonian's multidisciplinary work, because of our capacity, because of our strong convening power, we were asked to really look and investigate what Smithsonian could do, how Smithsonian could participate, how Smithsonian could collaborate with other institutions as a research museum complex to address the issues of not only the history of race and racism, but that legacy that we all live with now, and working on solutions with our partners across the country and beyond on really enabling a better future. Part of what we have done is to establish, in a sense, the arenas of focus that we felt we could address The Smithsonian is not a social service agency. We do not do medical work, but we also work with partners across the country who are cultural institutions that have very strong relationships, sometimes overlapping relationships with their stakeholders, communities, and partners that include a wide range of organizations and family types. We, in a sense, began by focusing on the areas we felt we could address, and that included 6 areas: race and wellness, race and place, race, public policy and ethics, race, art and aesthetics, and race beyond the United States. I think we all recognize that the United States is currently, more than any time in its history, a highly globalized society that is not only within the United States, but outside the United States. Many of the concepts of race that are portrayed in mainstream media have some, but often limited application to different communities. And we felt that this work was most effective in communities and with our partners, our institutional partners who have those direct relationships. So although we convened an initial meeting in Washington, D.C. in December of 2022, it was a 75-minute program where we announced what we were thinking of doing, but we recognized that there are many voices, many approaches, many histories, many different understandings of the experience of race, of racism in the past and currently. Los Angeles is one of the strongest places we felt where that breadth of American national experience is so strongly expressed. And we turned to 3 of what we felt were the leading organizations that do comparable work, but they have a history of addressing issues of race and racism. And that is why we're working with the organizations that you see today. They are also bringing partners, organizational and community partners on board. We feel that these program partners enjoy tremendous respect in their communities. Some are Smithsonian affiliated with Smithsonian formally, and others are very good friends of Smithsonian, known by Smithsonian for their effective work. They are already known, each of these partner organizations, to already be doing this work through exhibitions, programs, panels. They address race and racism head on in the work that they do. We felt that this would not only help amplify the work that they do, but it's a great learning experience for Smithsonian. I have a few visuals that can be shared. I think 4 slides that were sent that I would briefly like to comment on. Is someone going to post
Yes.
those for me?
Jessica?
Yes, I'm pulling them up right
Thank you. But as the quote at the beginning said, it's important to reckon with the history to understand where we got today and to use what we learned today to build a more equitable shared future. Next slide, please. This is just a photograph of the first convening that we did only in Washington, D.C. in December of 2022. It was hosted by the National African American Museum of History and Culture. And we had approximately 350 or so participants and attendees. Next slide, please. And we understand by being in Los Angeles, there will be so many more. We also, as part of our efforts, do professional development workshops and convenings across the US in museum conferences. Looking at some of the workshops that we've offered, they have highlighted the work in progress at Smithsonian around our national conversations on race. And these are just actually two posters that were developed as parts of recent professional workshops for museum professionals and related cultural professionals who are doing this kind of work. The next slide. The Smithsonian has been for some time collecting objects, images, etc., that are reflecting these issues of race and discrimination. And this poster of George Floyd, that is part of the collection of the National Museum of American History, is part of what we are looking at in examining the impact across the nation. And next slide. And although these are still images, we have also begun creating three-dimensional 3D scans of objects that reflect issues and concerns around race and racism. To the upper left, for instance, is a step stool from the Pullman porters, who were African-American porters on the trains during segregation, who supported and cared for African-American and other people of color on these national journeys. On the bottom left is a cowrie shell basket, a basket covered with shells that was used to dedicate the retrieval of elements of a slave ship in South Africa that was headed for the United States, that we've been able to document and that we portray in our exhibitions. Presently, we have some 45 objects from around the Smithsonian collections, and we'll be doing 3D scans and stories of another 75 this year. I believe that's my last image.
Well, this is so fascinating. Could we go back to the last slide, please, and just ask you, tell us about the chair and the hard hat and what looks like an electronic instrument. What do they symbolize?
Oh, let me see now. I'm trying to remember all of these. The lower right is actually the prototype of a heart monitor developed by an African-American physician. The first that was ever used, and then of course is used now. He invented the heart monitor for tracking patients. Originally, this was in a segregated hospital, an African-American only hospital. It's now, of course, very conventional and used all over. And I am trying to monitor my time here to be sure that I honor.
You're fine. I just think people are going to be so interested because what you're doing is really bringing the past alive and making it relevant to the present.
And in fact, what I will do immediately following my presentation is send the links that have very detailed information and the 3D scans that anyone can use even now. These have been launched in the last week to look at these things in 3 dimensions, to look at the stories related to them and where they come from. I think I will stop at this time just to allow for questions, only because I will have to, unfortunately, leave this convening early.
Well, thank you. And you've certainly whetted our appetite with these very concrete examples. A question that comes from our team is, at this particular time, reckoning with the past, do you use the term racist if it's negative, and racial if, as in the case of the heart monitor, it's positive? What is the correct term, racist or racial past?
An intent that is, the word racist is usually associated with negative intent by an individual or an organization or a policy. Some of these inventions, some of these creations are, of course, just totally neutral, but it's the context in which they were used or the context in which they had to be invented, that it lends the racial cast to it. Some of these objects that we have collected, and you'll see a number of them, I believe Travis Helms has put them, has placed the link in the chat.
Wonderful. We'll make sure everybody gets this. One other question, Dr. Mack, is right now we're in an era where reflecting on the racial past has become politicized in some parts of the country. Are you are in a way making us, or you're advancing a challenge to reflect on the past, to learn the past in order to understand the present and the future. But are you seeing much pushback? Are you realizing this is posing a political challenge in some parts of the country?
It absolutely poses political challenges in many places of the country. Having said that, we're seeing, for instance, from our museum colleagues across the country, a real desire to receive assistance on how to better or more clearly articulate and more effectively share this kind of information and reflect it in programs, et cetera. So while there have been, certainly I'm sure, organizations that have shied away from this difficulty in the past, quote unquote, it is so prevalent that we are seeing really the opposite, a surge of organizations that don't have the skill, for instance, or the experience that our three Los Angeles partners have, wanting to become far more effective and far more enabled in doing so. Another arena that we've seen a lot of response from have been teachers, especially I'd say K through 12, educators who are being literally punished for raising these issues have said to us that they use the work of the Smithsonian and they use the work of their partner organizations, their local museums, in a kind of defense. They're saying, you know, if this museum is working on this subject area and sharing it and educating the public, if the Smithsonian is doing this work, shouldn't we as well? So it's been very interesting, because while there has been pushback that has been intimidating, we're finding that the response is to work through difficulty even stronger. It's not easy in many places, but we don't see the reticence nearly as much as we had expected.
That's very good news. I want to thank you so much for making time today to join our briefing from Washington. And we're sorry you have to drop off, but you were a prime mover and shaker of this initiative, and having you has been invaluable. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And our team looks forward to being there live with you all next week. This is incredibly exciting. 2 weeks of programming is just massive, more than we could do by ourselves. And we would not be able to reach the wide range of audiences that these partner organizations can. So thanks to them.
Great. So now we go to our first speaker from these organizations in Los to welcome Leticia Buckley, CEO of Plaza. It's colloquially known, very well known in Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles, La Plaza de Cultura y Artes. And Ms. Buckley, when we first spoke, you said, if we don't talk about our history, we won't be able to move forward. That was an inspiring summary of this initiative. Welcome. Please share your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you, Dr. Mack. It's a privilege to be working with you and your team at the Smithsonian and bringing this really phenomenal initiative to Los Angeles. Buenos dias to all of our members of the media. It's important to note that institutions like ours, JANM and CAM, and other culturally rooted organizations exist to reckon with our racial past, give voice to the present, and affect the future. All of us do it by documenting history and sharing the lived experience of our communities. La Plaza de Cultura y Artes centers the history of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Los Angeles. And we share the accomplishments and experiences of Latinx people and Latino culture. We don't collect artwork, we collect stories because we know how important it is that they are told by us and not for us. We welcome thousands of people through our doors monthly to experience culturally rooted music, dance, culinary arts, multi-generational art making, and storytelling experiences, and through exhibitions. We provide a historical lens to Latinos' many contributions to Los Angeles, and also explore some of the significant episodes in our community's history, including things like the student walkouts and the Chicano moratorium. These stories are filled with trauma and sadness and defeat, but also joy and success and inspiration. Many of these aren't taught in schools or shared consistently in any formal way. So we work with K through 12 schools, developing curriculum, doing school visits, bringing students to the museum, and we see it as our responsibility to ensure the history is shared by the people that experience them. And, you know, Sandy, to your question, we look at the past to understand what happened and why, to address the harms that our communities have endured, but also to reckon with the harms that we may be guilty of inflicting. We can't get to the truth and reconciliation if we don't do the internal work as well. And for us, there was no question that we would be participating in this initiative, because the reality is the past isn't 75 years ago or 100 years ago, but it's last year and last month and last week. And all of our yesterday, all of our communities are facing these big challenges, and we need to be talking about them. We need to recognize our role in them, and we need to together collectively bring our voices in looking at how we get past some of them.
Could you give us an example of how the past highlights and explains structural racist policies today, and how you are going to be illuminating that in your exhibits for this initiative?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of really important examples. I mean, first and foremost, you know, through our exhibits, specifically thinking about things like the Chicano moratorium or the Westminster versus Mendez, pardon me, which was really the first case of segregation in schools, and the court battle and the win to remove segregation in Orange County. But for us, one of the critical things is, you know, as a perfect example in thinking about even some of the challenges that we were facing just recently in the Latino community, if we look at some of our political leaders and the reality of the harms of racist rhetoric and behavior that has surfaced over the past year in a really awful and hard light. At La Plaza, and the way we see it is, we are a convener of these conversations. We are not the experts. We are not the only ones that have a voice in these conversations. And so part of this effort for us is the launching of an Afro-Latino series over the next year in addressing and discussing issues within our communities like anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous communities. And again, made and brought very raw to our community, to our Latino community in Los Angeles just in the last year. You know, we partner with organizations like the Organización Regional de Oaxaca, ORO, Regional Organization of Oaxaca, on a number of our family days. So multi-generational, disciplinary programming that is offered, and we aren't the ones doing it. We do it in partnership. So similar to what Dr. Mack was saying around the fact that we have built trust and relationships in Los Angeles, we look to our partners and collaborators who have also built that trust. So really leveraging in many ways our own privilege as institutions that are participating in this initiative that have relationships with the Smithsonian. Not all culturally rooted organizations do, and therefore leveraging that to ensure that we're bringing other voices into the conversation who frankly have a much a stronger pulse on what's going on in those communities on a daily basis.
There is, as I asked Dr. Mack, there is this strong current now that we're not supposed to challenge what's in the history books, and that we should not allow people to tell negative things about especially white Americans' historical role. How do you, as a cultural center, deal with these currents and explain why we can't really progress, we can't really move forward unless we reconcile ourselves to the realities of the past?
Well, the reality is we are working within systems that were not meant for us to be working within. So really it becomes, for us at least, it's not about even dismantling the systems itself and rebuilding, but it's in many ways creating our own and moving forward those conversations and those actions. And so that's what we do at La Plaza every day. We tell those stories. Frankly, it has not been an issue for us or a concern for us because we're committed to this mission and we're committed to telling these stories. Place like La Plaza doesn't exist in other places. We're one of a few across the country. And if we're not telling those stories, no one else will. And so for us, it in many ways gives us even more reason to continue to push forward and tell those stories and make sure that they're being discussed, knowing that they're hard and that these are challenging conversations. I mean, you can't talk about racism without it being difficult. That's why it continues. And that's why it's perpetuated over and over again, because it's hard, but we have to continue to do it. And we do it in a variety of different ways. Sometimes those conversations are like this, straight on, face to face, in direct conversation. And other times it's in celebrating the diversity of the cultures, diversity of Latinidad. Again, thinking about our partnership with the Oaxacan committee as part of our family day. Dia de los Muertos, that is a completely and totally, that event for us in here at La Plaza was driven by the Oaxacan community. And so it can look in a variety of different ways. We do it through cooking demonstrations and conversations around food, indigenous ingredients, decolonizing ingredients, and also bringing together. One of the examples that we'll be doing as part of this initiative is actually a conversation about Chinese and Mexican cooking at the border in Mexicali, and that intersection. And so for us, it's very much a constant.
You're really making us understand that the role of museum isn't about the past so much as it's about a continuum of constant experience that informs each of our lives and is critical to spotlighting where we're moving as a culture. I would be remiss if I didn't also pay tribute to the remarkable way La Plaza documents the role of ethnic media and the earliest Spanish language media in Los Angeles. It truly was a joy to be able to see some of the earliest records of Spanish language media. So with that, thank you. Please stay on. There'll be more questions. but we're going to go to our next speaker. And I'm sorry, my dog is insisting on having a word in edgewise. I'm going to go to Michael Trong, Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum, whose interview inspired our opening introduction. How can you reconcile with the past if it's invisible? Michael, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sandy. And, we also want to thank the Smithsonian for really allowing us to be a part of this initiative. And it's been really inspiring to be working with our partners at Plaza and at Janum. This collaboration has been really interesting to see that, the stories that we're telling is, it's part of American history. It's a part of American stories. We're just putting on a different lens to it and to tell our truth and to tell, the importance of different perspectives of understanding how we are able to reconcile with our history in the past. One of the things about the Chinese American Museum this year, that in December, we're turning 20 years old. And when we think about the Chinese American Museum, and many of you may have not been to the museum, and which is okay, because, it's a space that celebrates the Chinese American experience. But, I've been at the museum since 2005 and started over 18 years ago. But really having a museum sharing about the history of America through the Chinese American lens is just as important today as it was when we opened. We didn't think that when the founders opened the museum, our community would be experiencing an increase of anti-hate in our marginalized communities. But they knew that we needed a space to really share this history that people are not really aware of, reclaiming a forgotten history, so we can learn from the past and not have to relive it. So I just want to begin today to really discuss the Chinese American Museum and our work when we opened the doors in 2003 to share the Chinese American experience in Los Angeles and beyond. When we think about a museum in Los Angeles, about this experience, we're thinking about us being in Chinatown. And we often get the questions, from my visitors. Chinatown is 5 minutes away. It's a 5-minute walk. Why are we located here, not across the street from Union Station, next to Rivera Street, and not in Chinatown as we know today? And I explain it. We are in Los Angeles, Chinatown. This is part of historic Chinatown. This is part of history in Los Angeles. When we think about the Chinatown today, it was built in the 1930s. But the Chinese has been settling in Los Angeles since the 1850s. So when we think about Chinatown, so we think about LA and Chinese American history, there's 80 years of forgotten history, a period where we're now talking about the Chinese Massacre of 1871, I'm sorry, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, or the California Alien Land Law in 1913 and 1920s. Because again, yes, Sandy?
Michael, I think many of us don't know what the Chinese Massacre of 1871 was. Could you just help us? Because
definitely. The Chinese Massacre of 1871, was in Los Angeles and actually are on our doorsteps. Where there was actually two clans who were fighting against one another, who had an argument. And during this heated argument, gunfires were shot. And a bystander accidentally got killed. And 500 Los Angelinos came into Los Angeles, Chinatown, and lynched and killed 18 boys and men, right? And this was about 10% of the Chinese population. And the stories like this, where it's forgotten, is not discussed, and how, and the question comes up with, how do we reckon with our historic past, with our racial past, if we don't even know the history, right? So how do we really think about healing when we don't know what to heal and how we can heal? Right. So that's the work of the museum, is to really not just be a place to remember the past, but also to make sure that history is told. The fact that we're able to work with the public, work with these various institutions to tell history in our own words, in our own voices, and to make sure it's as accurate as it can be. And how not only does it impact our communities, but also how do we explore ways where there are connections and similarities with other communities as well. You know, we have to be a place where we unite people and not divide people. And we have seen how division has increased violence in our community. You know, when we hear dangerous rhetoric like the Chinese must go historically, but now with, you know, with the recent pandemic or the Kung flu or the China virus, how this dangerous rhetoric leads to violence, and how do we able to think about rhetoric that is dangerous historically, how it led to violence, and hearing it now, you know, some media, some folks might think, oh, that's just something that's cute that people are saying, you know, something ridiculous that people are saying. But we know that these terms can lead to violence, and we've seen that with the increase of anti-Asian hate during the pandemic and even now, right? So we have to understand our history where dangerous violence, dangerous rhetoric can lead to violence. And when we hear dangerous rhetoric now, we have to stop that from spreading and stopping that from occurring. So that's the work that we've been doing.
There's a question in the chat, Michael, and in the interest of time, I'll read it. But does the Chinese American Museum also include the experiences of other Asian American Pacific Islander communities, or is it pretty focused on the Chinese experience?
The museum, you know, we're a part of the Asian American experience. So whether, you know, we talk about the Chinese American experience, you know, it also talks about the Chinese diaspora as well. You know, my last name is Trong, so I am Vietnamese Chinese American, right? So there's this aspect of understanding that we're a part of an American experience, but we're also part of the Asian American experience as well. So the work that we do have a Chinese American lens to it, but there's an understanding the fact that we're a part of a larger community of Asian America, but also of Americans in general.
And to what extent are new arrivals from Chinese diaspora, not just from mainland China, but Taiwan, Singapore, all over the world, immigrants coming recently, how much do you think they are aware of the racial past of Chinese in California?
You know, the only way that people are able to know the story and the history is if it's taught to them. And the challenges that we have seen is the fact that these stories aren't taught in the classroom. You know, when we think about the Chinese American experience and what's taught in the classroom, what's taught in the classroom is the Chinese work on the railroad, right? And that's what's commonly has been told in California history, also in American history. But what's interesting is we're taught Chinese worked on railroad, but the photograph that we use to celebrate the completion of the railroad does not have any Chinese representation in this photograph at all, the Golden Spike ceremony, right? So there is this contradiction already about how do we introduce Chinese American history, but then also how do we celebrate that completion and that work that the Chinese laborers have worked on, right? So, you know, our efforts has been, as you know, La Plaza has mentioned, you know, work with teachers and students and educators to really to bring this knowledge not just into the classroom, but telling it as part of this American history. You know, make sure that it's told as our history as being in America, as part of being Americans.
Last question from the chat is very relevant to what you've just said. Will photos of the exhibitions at your Chinese American Museum and the other agencies, will they be available to the schools? Are you expanding the exhibitions to include demonstrations or presentations in the schools? And Leticia, Michael, and Jim, you you can all address that very quickly before we go to our last speaker. But Michael, starting with you, how are you engaging schools in this?
We have educators guides that we work with the teachers to introduce this topic into the classroom. We have also raised funds specifically for buses to have students come to the museum so they could further the education about the Chinese American experience. And what's really great is the fact that La Plaza is actually across the street. So not only are we encouraging people to come to the museum, but also explore across the street from us as well. So they're able to understand this deeper, diverse Los Angeles community and history.
Leticia, do you want to add? You mentioned the schools, but
Yeah, we do. We do have curriculum and school site visit based programming tied to our permanent exhibit, which is LA Starts Here and Calle Principal or Main Street. And both those have a variety of different components of the stories, from repatriation to redlining to colonization. So all of that are all tied to curriculum that we offer that both include in school and out and on site, including art making experiences as part of a tour. Similarly to Michael, we have a free bus program for Title I schools in K through 12. So, and we're looking to expand that as we go along. And specifically for this initiative, we will, for our family day, we are developing specific art making curriculum for activities on that day that we will then also provide externally.
thank you. We go now to our next speaker, who I think confused people by referencing you not only as the director of the National Center for the Preservation of Democracy, but also that is within the context of the Japanese American National Museum. Mr. He, could you just help us by explaining the relationship and then talk about your role in this wonderful initiative?
Sure. Thank you, Sandy. And thank you, everybody, who's on the call today. We really appreciate it. And again, thank you to our Smithsonian partners as well. The National Center for the Preservation of Democracy was founded about 20 years ago with the help of then Senator Daniel K. Inouye. And he was a driving force behind the museum as well as the Democracy Center, and envisioned a place where people could convene and have conversations around democracy, especially around the issues brought up through the Japanese American experience in the United States. The Japanese American National Museum is seated in a very, very special place. It is hallowed ground in the community. It was originally founded in what is now the first Buddhist temple in Los Angeles, while the main pavilion was being built. But it is on a plaza that used to be Central Avenue in Los Angeles at First Street. And that was the place where Japanese Americans in Los Angeles were ordered to report before being incarcerated in the internment camps. So this was a place of American history, of a deeply sad time in American history, when American citizens were stripped of their rights and their due process. And so it is not outside sort of the realm of thinking that the Japanese American National Museum wants to have these issues addressed, especially when they continue to come up in our history of America. When there was a call for Muslim Americans to be incarcerated after 9/11, and when there was the Muslim travel ban, JANM was among the first organizations to speak out against that. And so there is this strong history of JANM speaking out on issues that are about social justice, about equity, about democracy. And so we are excited, actually, because after a period of being a little quiet, the Democracy Center is actually formally relaunching this Friday after the event that will open the Smithsonian Symposium. And we look forward to a period when we can have these conversations with broader communities. It gives us the opportunity to lean on the amazing history that JANM has collected over the years, the people, the stories, the artifacts, the collections, And we lean on that story at the Democracy Center, but we contemporize it for other audiences. So we look to bring in the broader AAPI community, the faith communities around Los Angeles, the Latino, the African American communities, to have these conversations, because it is a time now that feels like democracy is under attack, where our communities are being marginalized, and that marginalization leads to not wanting to participate in democracy, and that just compounds the issue. So this is the time to have these conversations and to do this work. And the Smithsonian program, when Dr. Mack and her team came to visit us, it just seemed like such a natural opportunity for us to broaden and deepen this work. We want to have these conversations around race because we are feeling marginalized. We are the Japanese American community. It is the Chinese American community, it is the Latin American community, but it is American communities and American stories that we are a part of. Being Japanese American or Asian American does not separate us from being American as much as some people would like to see that, especially these days. We have an exhibit that comes to us from the Smithsonian that just opened a couple weeks ago, called The Bias Inside of Us. And that looks at the issue of implicit bias and how pernicious it can be, and how difficult it can be to separate out those things that just are automatic within us. And it is important. It looks at bias from a scientific standpoint. We all have bias towards something or for something or against something. It's just natural. It's how we, as our ancestors, got off the savannah. But what we do with that bias, how we interact with it, how we put it out into the world is something that we can control. And so we hope that all of these experiences, the exhibition, the symposium, all the programming that we're doing over the course of the first couple of weeks in December, will help bring people together and help understand and build empathy for communities and across communities.
We have a question in the chat that I'm going to ask our reporter to ask. Henrietta Burrows, would you ask your question?
Thanks, Sandy. When you're telling the truth about America's ethnic groups and America's history, it can bring up feelings of hatred and resentment and bitterness towards those in power and towards what has always been the dominant race. So how can these stories be told and shared so that the outcome fosters harmony and collaboration?
So I think it goes back to my point about building empathy. Empathy is not feeling, kind towards someone or feeling something like someone else is feeling. It is feeling what that person feels. So if we can build empathy among communities, if we can build empathy among the ruling class as to what we're experiencing, hopefully that can build bridges. But in the end, we're not responsible, any of us, for how other people feel or think or act. If they choose to be that way, we can only lead with our hearts and hope that they can see us for who we are, which is Americans. And it is a really, really difficult and hard time. We just recently talked about the education programs that our institutions do, and like our colleagues at La Plaza and at the Chinese American Museum, JANM has a really, really robust program, and we bring people in, students, to see a very, very difficult time of American history, and it's one that during the pandemic we were actually able to expand to other parts of the country because of virtual technology. But it's also now becoming an issue for some teachers in parts of the country where they're afraid to tell these stories because of what might happen. And so it makes it even more important for us to be out there, because being silent is not the answer.
I'd like to ask each of you, there's been a lot of raw feelings provoked by trying to uncover real history by replacing statues, changing institutional names, changing street names. I'm thinking, of course, of taking down the statue of Robert E. Lee, which was a tremendously provocative, seen as almost a zero-sum game. To destroy the statue meant disrespect for one part of the population, even as another part reclaimed the reality of history. I think that's what Henrietta's question is getting at, and you gave a very good example. But do you see examples of where our kind of street names are names of some of our academic institutions, our statues in Los Angeles cover up important racial and racist historical events that are still informing our lives and our opportunities today?
With respect to the statues issue, I think the context of why those statues were erected in the first place is the issue, not so much the statues themselves. To forget about that part of history in any of its parts is not right. But I think the contextualization of history is important.
Thank you. And Leticia,
Yeah.
how do we make sure that we're not just accepting or taking for granted a history that wasn't written with an understanding of what really happened to communities that were denied the right to write their own history?
Yeah, well, I think this is a perfect example of why an initiative like this is so important, because it's got to start somewhere, and those conversations have to begin. And what we are, we can all be doing this on our own, JANM and CAM and La Plaza and other, again, culturally rooted institutions. But frankly, the power of the Smithsonian and the leveraging of the Smithsonian and the power dynamic of it and the lifting up of all of those voices is important and critical to address these wrongs that were done to communities of color. It's the reality, it's the fact of our history. I happen to, in Los Angeles, have been part of the county when the Christopher Columbus statue was removed for Grand Park, which is a county park, a public park, and that statue was removed in partnership with the Native American communities in Los Angeles, and they determined what was going to happen with that statue once it was done, once it was removed. It was a time of healing. They determined how to remove it, when it was going to be removed, and then the process in which to create some healing, and now figuring out what comes afterwards in those spaces. So, I recognize the idea of getting us to a place of harmony and collaboration, but to Jim's point, the reality is that's not, we're telling the truth, we're telling the history. It's not our responsibility to ensure that my opinion, to ensure that everybody feels good about it at the end of it, because it's just not a good feeling situation. Racism does not feel good at any point in the time. That's what truth and reconciliation is all about. Getting beyond the hard to get to the other side, to the empathy. I think Jim really is right. It's about being empathetic. It's not about, everybody is going to love each other or whatever, but we need to be empathetic to each other as human beings and our right to be human beings. And so, that's part of this process. And that's part of why these kinds of initiatives are so important, and why, frankly, having all of you here listening and participating in it is really critical, because you are the ones that are then telling the stories to the community at large.
So, Michael, your comments on this, and then I have a final question.
No, I think that, as Jim mentioned, I think this understanding intent, right? The purpose for things. I think museums are a space to tell the story, tell a truth, but it's also a space where there's this expectation of learning, right? So when it comes to things like statues and naming, right? We do statues and namings to honor or to memorialize or to remember. So we have to remember the intentions of these aspects and what they're created for. If these statues are removed or things are replaced, perhaps we should also put it in a space where we remember why they were replaced or why they were removed. I think a lot of times history has been erased because of the way things are named. For example, Los Angeles Griffith Park, is a space that we celebrate, but Griffith was not the greatest person in Los Angeles, right? But we still celebrate the park, and people don't know or understand his history to Los Angeles. So I think there's a prime example of why naming and memorializing is important, and why we need to understand the history of why we're memorializing individuals or people or events.
This has been so helpful. We have other questions in the chat, which we won't have time to get into, but we so rarely have the opportunity to go deeper into how our abstractions, like reckoning with the racist past, actually can be brought to life by institutions such as yours. My question, since many of us are not based in Los Angeles, we have African American Museum in Fresno, we have we have organizations that recognize the importance of Armenians in the Central Valley, of Asian Indians in Silicon Valley, of Native Americans in the North counties like Del Norte and Butte and Siskiyou. How do we bring stories of what you're doing to help inspire these agencies to either replicate, or perhaps they already are replicating? How do we tell your story in a way that connects with institutions that are doing similar work in the rest of the state? And that is my final question. I'll start with Leticia.
Well, I will say that a lot of institutions, again, culturally rooted institutions who do similar work are connected in one way or another. But I think really this is an example of the kinds of collaborations that can happen, because first of all, I think it's recognizing that a lot of this work does happen already. It is happening. It may be in, not as widespread and not, again, with the privilege of a partnership with the Smithsonian, but connecting even us to those folks at a minimum, right? To just, again, build those collaborations and to build those conversations. Because the other part of it is there's also a regional component to all of this. What is happening in Los Angeles is not necessarily happening in Central California, and frankly, maybe worse or better or whatever the case is. So it's recognizing that every community is dealing with these topics differently. And so it's first recognizing that and acknowledging the people that are doing the hard work on the ground already. And then it's just these kinds of collaborations, exploring them and moving forward with them to ensure that we continue to uplift them. And again, I think the media has a big hand in that.
Thank you. Jim, I'll go to you, Jim Herr, and then end with Michael Trong on this question. It is relevant. You're bringing a cultural dimension to what all too often is seen narrowly as a political struggle, and what the role culture can play through, as you say, culturally rooted institutions is exactly what some of our questions are asking. How do we make this lead to healing? But
So,
how do we make sure our whole state is aware of your important work?
so I think that Los Angeles holds a special place in the world, as probably one of the most diverse places, the home to the largest communities outside of their home nations are here. That to have this conversation here in Los Angeles, I think, is the way that we show that we lead, that we are always ahead of the curve. And so we can celebrate that, and we can show other people throughout California and throughout Los Angeles, or throughout the country, that culture should be something that is celebrated, that it's not a zero-sum game. Me wanting to celebrate Japanese American culture or Filipino American culture or my German heritage does not come at the cost of celebrating other cultures. And that the old idea of the Western canon of art being the dominant art form in this country has to change, because this country has changed. And we cannot continue to leave out the histories of millions and millions of people who have come to this country for the same opportunities and for the same futures that other people have come to in the past. We are Americans first, but we celebrate that which we have brought to this country.
Thank you. Michael Trong, how do you take the history of Chinatown, the historical events like the massacre in 1871, which reminds me of what we never knew about Tulsa until this period of reckoning? How are you connecting to, say, Marysville or other San Francisco, the Asian American Museum? Are you collaborating with them on this initiative?
I think in terms of collaborations, especially with this partnership with the Smithsonian, it's what's unique about, working with La Plaza and with Janum is that, it makes sense in terms of regional commonalities, right? But it's also amongst us three and a lot of community of color is to share commonalities of history, right? As you mentioned in Tulsa and also up north and even Washington, there are history that are very shared and has very similar experiences. And we had to focus on the shared aspects of it and the similarities of it and not the differences, right? The differences is what makes us unique at times, but we'll also remember that there are ways that we are able to connect with one another and build upon that shared future and that, and that shared memory in ways that makes it a lot more powerful when we do these collaborations, because people don't see those connections unless we are able as institutions to make light of these commonalities.
Right. Thank you, the three of you and Dr. Mack, for giving us this very inspiring hour of conversation. We want to make sure that we send information about the exhibits to all our media that were on the call. I think there's no question many of us will want to come and visit your three agencies with fresh eyes and renewed understanding. Thank you very, very much for letting us share your work and the Smithsonian initiative on reckoning with the racial past to move forward into the future. Our conference is now adjourned. Thank you.